Hello. We are, thought that water was in the way, but it wasn't. Uh, we're starting Numbers chapter 19. I know I sound like a broken record, but if this is your first video, please go back, build some foundation into this. It'll make way more sense. Um, but this is one of those chapters, or the story in this chapter is one of those a lot of people have heard about, but maybe not really sure why they've heard about it. They've just heard someone refer to it. And that's the red heifer ceremony. So maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't. Doesn't affect your salvation. It's just one of those things. This is the chapter where we find it, and this is the chapter where hopefully we'll understand a little bit more about it. So let's jump in to Numbers chapter 19 in the New Living Translation, and I'll point out a couple of things, but otherwise it does an okay job. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, here is another legal requirement commanded by the Lord. And what's funny about not funny, but sad about the way it's been interpreted is they put legal requirement. And when you go over to the complete Jewish Bible, it says regulation from the Torah, which Adonai commanded. So they like to make it sound like a law. So we're getting rid of that rather than say, hey, this is something God said do. It's not the same thing, I guess. So those kind of things bug me. I like to point them out. So tell the people of Israel to bring you a red heifer, a perfect animal that has no defects and has never been yoked to a plow. Give it to Eleazar the priest, and it will be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Eleazar will take some of its blood on his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tabernacle. As Eleazar watches, the heifer must be burned, its hide, meat, blood, and dung. Eleazar the priest must then take a stick of cedar, a hyssop branch, and some scarlet yarn and throw them into the fire where the heifer is burning. Then the priest must wash his clothes and bathe himself in water. Afterward, he may return to the camp, though he will remain ceremonially unclean until evening. The man who burns the animal must also wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and he too will remain unclean until evening. Then someone who is ceremonially clean will gather up the ashes of the heifer and deposit them in a purified place outside the camp. They will be kept there for the community of Israel to use in the water for the purification ceremony. This ceremony is performed for the removal of sin. The man who gathers up the ashes of the heifer must also wash his clothes, and he will remain ceremonially unclean until evening. This is a permanent law for the people of Israel and any foreigners who live among them. And this is another one when you jump over to verse 10 in the complete Jewish Bible. It says, the one who collected the ashes of the heifer is to wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. For the people of Israel and for the foreigners staying with them, this will be a permanent regulation. And to me, the wording there, not only is it true to the original, but it also should be for us to say, hey, for everybody who's tied into the covenants of Israel, foreigner or native born Israelite, this applies to you. So this applies to us. All those who touch a dead human body will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. They must purify themselves in the 3rd and 7th days with the water of purification. Then they will be purified. But if they do not do this on the 3rd and 7th days, they will continue to be unclean even after the 7th day. All those who touch a dead body and do not purify themselves in the proper way defile the Lord's tabernacle, and they will be cut off from the community of Israel. Since the water of purification was not sprinkled on them, their defilement continues. So this is the ritual law that applies when someone dies inside a tent. All those who enter that tent and those who were inside when the death occurred will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Any open container in the tent that was not covered with a lid is also defiled. And if someone in an open field touches the corpse of someone who was killed with the sword or who died a natural death, or if someone touches a human bone or a grave, that person will be defiled for 7 days. To remove the defilement, put some ashes from the burnt purification offering in a jar and pour fresh water over them. Then someone who is ceremonially clean must take a hyssop branch and dip it into the water. That person must sprinkle the water on the tent, on all the furnishings of the tent, and on the people who were in the tent. Also on the person who touched a human bone, or touched someone who was killed, or who died naturally, or touched a grave. On the third and seventh days, the person who is ceremonially clean must sprinkle the water on those who are defiled. Then on the seventh day, the people being cleansed must wash their clothes and bathe themselves, and that evening they will be cleansed of their defilement. But those who have become defiled and do not purify themselves will be cut off from the community, for they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. Since the water of purification has been sprinkled on them, they remain defiled. This is the permanent law for the people. Those who sprinkle the water of purification must afterwards wash their clothes, and anyone who touches the water used for purification will remain defiled until evening. Anything and anyone that a defiled person touches will be ceremonially unclean until evening. And so a lot of people would say, well, what's that got to do with me? That kind of stuff is like, I'm sanctified, right? Well, one of the things that Jesus did was purify us. He didn't eliminate unclean things in the world. He cleansed us from our uncleanness. So this applies to us because we sometimes either lower or forget what he actually did for us. And Jews know that if they accept the Messiah, because they see what it cost to be made clean once you were defiled. So they understand the cost of what Jesus paid. That matters in your walk. So there's a guy named Rabban Johanan ben Zaki. He's a rabbi, and he said this: I'm not entirely sure how the whole thing works, but I know that the cow has no magical power in itself. And I know that a corpse can't inherently defile anybody. In the end, we do this red cow purification procedure because God said to do it. And if we do it, and if we do so, he will count us as purified, and it is not permitted to do otherwise. So when we talk about the red heifer ceremony or the red cow, and we refer to it as either sometimes both in a message, but what he's saying here is it's not about the power in the things. It's about the obedience to what God said. And if we do it with the heart of intent, then it works. There's no magic in the bull or in the water or any of that stuff. It's in the one who developed it. And that's why we do it. So a red cow, or what we would call a red heifer, it's never been used for work, meaning it's never been yoked. This red heifer is going to be killed in an unclean place. The priest would cut the throat and gather the blood. He would then face the door of the sanctuary and sprinkle some blood 7 times in the direction of the sanctuary. While the cow was being burned up, the priest would throw cedar wood, hyssop, and a red-colored thread on top of it. Now the priest had to remove his priestly garments and bathe, and then after he could re-enter the camp. But he remained in a ritually unclean state until the sun set. So next, a man who is ritually clean has to gather the ashes to combine with water and make this purification liquid, this jar of liquid. So this man, in gathering the ashes, becomes defiled. So he had to wash his clothes and take a bath and remain unclean until sunset. And this mixture was thrown on the home or the tent, and whoever came into contact with that person. The sprinkling procedure, this whole procedure happened twice. On first time was on the 3rd day, and then the last time was on the 7th day. And so all of this work is going on. All these people are involved in it. And the defiled persons were then ritually pure at the end of the 7th day. So anyone who did not go through this procedure was cut off. They were thrown out. And we might look at that and say, well, that's really too much. That's not really fair. Well, the point is not fairness, obviously. The point is to do what God said. But his point and his pattern and principle that he's setting up is remove it from the camp. And once it's removed, you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's not living with a ticking time bomb. It's taking that time bomb and saying, hey, I'm going to throw it out of the camp. I don't want it anywhere near me. And he's teaching those principles that he's going to develop throughout the Bible. So, uh, the person who has been defiled by a dead body and refuses God's provision to be made clean has defiled the Lord's sanctuary. So basically, when we say, well, you should accept Christ as your Messiah. And if you don't, that's your choice. But I think, and we can't do this because it sounds bad, but I wish Christians understood, and the lost did, that by not receiving it, we are defiling our God's sanctuary. We are blaspheming against God. Just like if a lifeguard threw you a life jacket and you just said, I don't want it. I want one from somebody else or some other way, and you drown. Well, what's the point of that? And God's saying, I put this in position for you. I want you to do it because you want to be in relationship with me. If you're not willing to accept the way I provided, then you don't really want to be in a relationship with me. So let's hear everybody that has anything to do with its preparation, death, burning up, or the gathering of the ashes becomes unclean. People who are following God's command in this ritual law of purification, they begin in a clean state, but wind up becoming ritually impure. So they have to wait. The unclean person who made clean from all these ashes of the red heifer. But the clean persons who perform the ritual apply the ashes are made unclean. So he's teaching us that principle. The method I'm going to provide you will put the uncleanness, the sin, the pain, the suffering on me. I will provide an avenue for that for you. And that way, whenever Christ said that's what he was doing, they could all think back to this red heifer purification and go, well, wait, he's even doing that. He's providing this purification, but more than that, he's taking on the defilement to rid it from us. I mean, that makes the story of Jesus even bigger than it was when we were kids and we think, well, he died for our sins. Well, yes, but he also took defilement and sin and all of that stuff on himself. God provided that for us. That makes the Bible amazing, I think. So this is the opposite from all the other sacrifices. The other sacrifices atone and often make clean. But this particular sacrifice was different than that. It took clean people and made the unclean clean and them unclean. And so he's teaching us that pattern. What is the real meaning of the term holy? I know we talked about this in earlier videos back in Genesis, but in Hebrew, Kodesh or Kadash is essentially holy, meaning separated, set apart for God. So a person could be Kadash for destruction, or they could be Kadesh for Satan. They could be set apart for that. Holy is not a Hebrew word, that's an English word. So for Kodesh or Kadash, so you may hear those two. When something is Kadash for God, separated for service to him, then it carries with it the sense of holy that we think of holy. But the red heifer isn't so much holy as it's simply Kadash, set apart. It is set apart not for service to God, but for destruction, and will be used by God to make his plan, to make his people clean. And so it's Kadash in that it's set apart, but the heifer's not holy. There's nothing special about the heifer. The sacrificial animal purifies by absorbing the defiled person's impurity. This is what Christ did on the cross. He absorbed all of our impurities. So the Hottentot sacrificial animal behaves like a spiritual sponge. And since the Hottentot sacrificial animal becomes contaminated with impurity, it must be destroyed. So it's burned up. It must even be destroyed away from anything clean. It's not the one who performs the ritual sacrifice that receives its benefit in this particular ritual. The purpose of the standard Hottentot sacrifice is to use the blood for purifying the sanctuary. It's not used to purify the one who brings the offering. So in verse 20, that if anyone does not purify themselves, they will be cut off. So it's saying if you're not willing to accept God's provided method of becoming clean and holy, then you'll be cut off. He's again teaching us a pattern. It's not. I'm sorry. It is the defilement of God's sanctuary that's the issue. That how do we protect His sanctuary? The ashes of the red heifer, when mixed with living water, are designed to purify the sanctuary of God. The people of God are in some mysterious ways also sanctuaries of God. That's what the Bible says. I don't always understand this part either. But when the Roman soldiers stabbed Jesus in the side, what flowed out? Blood and water. So, because blood atones and water purifies, and both are needed. And so that was the ultimate demonstration of Him providing everything the Old Testament looked towards. He was it. He became it, took it all on His own. Blood removes sin, water removes uncleanliness. So, what was the purification mixture here? Blood and water. The blood was in the ashes of the heifer, mixed with the water of the purification, and applied to the person contaminated with death. I mean, that's the first literal example of Jesus, his physical acts on earth in the Old Testament being brought forward. And if we focus on the perfect red heifer, as some do, they're out looking for it now, they're missing the point of the story by focusing on one detail of the story and missing the context of it. That's what you're doing now. You're learning the context of the Bible. And I'm hoping that opens up a whole new door for you to know Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, Yeshua, because He loves you and He wants a real relationship with you, not just one based on something you said or did a while back. I want you to have that real relationship with Him. So does He. So God bless. Love God, love people, and change the world.